What are the biggest problem society?
I think the biggest problem is structural poverty. And when I say structural poverty, I mean a type of classism where you're going to inevitably get exploitation of people in order to maintain its status quo. So I think the biggest challenge is the economic system. I think personally, the way the economic system is run, mainly based upon usury, and usury being an inevitable redistribution of wealth from the very poor to the very rich. And usury has been a mechanism which has subjugated people for thousands of years. It's the reason why every civilization has collapsed, because of usury. So I think the biggest challenge, looking at the roots, is the economic system by which we all trade our products, our services, our resources. So this is where I feel is the biggest challenge for us to overcome, because the way I see it is that society is structurally designed in order to have this poverty as a perpetual part of its status quo.
And what's your vision of future?
Well, I think the vision is to be decentralized. I think this idea that we all rally behind an empire and the empire will then distribute resources fairly and give people a quality of life, I think it's a broken model, and it's something that we haven't seemed to have learned from looking past that history, because the same types of cause and effects are in motion. So again, a city is a habitation of people which cannot sustain its own needs within the local environment, so therefore they then go to other areas in order to extract resources. So what happens after that is that inevitably you run out of resources to extract locally. Then you have to start to go further and further, and this is why empire and colonialism has always been one and the same, because the ability to sustain one's population's resource of food, material, everything they basically need, it's inevitable. So I feel the way to go forward is to decentralize, is to break away from these big I guess mega city structures, mega nations, and people going back to how people had lived before, prior to industrialization, which was local communities, living locally, growing food together, building homes together, having an extended family structure by which they raised their children, by which they hunted, grew their food, etc., and having that as a way by which people are no longer dependent upon outsourcing all of their basic needs to a government or or like a industrial model.
What is the obstacle for this? I mean, is it? I think I also identify with this vision. I'm inspired by your words, but somehow, are we allowed to do this, or there's some groups of people, or they will not let us do this. You know?
So the biggest challenge, you mean, how we can do this?
Is it possible to do it, or it's like we're condemned to stay in this kind of
Absolutely, I think it's very possible. However, the main barrier is our own psychology, because we have bought into this concept of materialism. So therefore, we demand a certain lifestyle, and an elite are then there trying to supply it to us through war, through economic corruption and so forth. Yeah, it's possible, but we have to be willing to give up our choice of 100 breakfast cereals or 50 different colors of the same pair of shoes. It does start ultimately with us, because we being the consumer, we being the majority, there's more people who demand a certain life than there are who are supplying it. So if you want to affect the whole demand and supply model of this system, you have to stop demanding excess, basically, and we're to blame. Absolutely. How I see it is that those who demand come first, and then those who then come in and then supply is a consequence of that. So somehow in our past, possibly industrialized conditioning, we tend to equate success with having vast material choice, excessive enjoyment, excessive different food choices. If you think about it, the average plate of food that we eat is drawn upon resources from all over the world. You may have some food from the Middle East, some food from Asia, some from South America. We're living lives that only medieval kings in the past would have been able to live. So I think ultimately our own enslavement comes by ourselves. So it's possible if we are able to be more content with a more simple life. And a simple life doesn't mean poverty. A simple life means that we are content with the basics, but also finding harmony and pleasure and enjoyment in other things outside of materialism. An example of that could be having local communities which are in projects to develop their local communities. Some will be builders, some will be artists, musicians, some will have an affinity to do various different things, but all collectively they fill all the needs of that society. So it's not a case of, oh, people will be forced into doing different roles. Rather, people will find what they enjoy doing, as they always did before. And I feel like that is a way that societies come together organically, you know. And I think the challenge is, yeah, it's with us. If we're so used to having such excess, you know, 20 pairs of trousers and, you know, a refrigerator and a freezer full of food, that comes at a cost. You know, that level of excess comes at a cost, and that cost is slavery and servitude. So this is why I feel we're being trapped. We're being trapped by our own desires, number one, but number two, we're actually funding our own oppression, because again, we're no longer giving our wealth to the local farmer or the local gardener or the local builder. We're outsourcing to big corporations, which are then using that, funneling the taxations or the lack of tax that they pay, and what they save going back to the government, which then funds the paramilitary, the soldiers, the police force. So it's a closed circle, you know. So I think the only way forward is if we realize that, look, this whole industrialized materialism dream was an illusion, and it came at a cost of our own enslavement. So better to, my opinion is to find ways back into the countryside, you know, start local community projects, have families again, you know, because there's an epidemic of underpopulation, especially in the developed world. People are no longer able to have enough children to sustain their future societies. On average, every man and woman has to have at least 2.1 child per family, just to replace when mother and father become old and die. Well, now in the developed world, populations at a replacement rate of an average of 1.3, 1.2. This is not enough to sustain population. So regardless of the myth of overpopulation, there is no problem with population at all. The Earth can sustain more than enough, even if our population doubled. But the problem is that people are being encouraged into an overcrowded environment, whereas there's 95% of the world just left bare, which you know, it could be utilized in a natural way. If human beings caught enough fish for themselves or grew enough for themselves, there'd never be a problem. The problem isn't that that the common people are draining the oceans dry. It's the industrialized big fishing projects, as well as the big grain producing projects. That's the problem. You know, the Earth has always sustained common man to be able to take as much as he needs. But it's when excess is being pulled out the earth and pulled out the sea, it's that excess that then eventually 60% goes to waste. So there's no shortage of resource. That's an illusion. You know, there's just a very poor distribution of that resource. So.
But I don't want to sound pessimistic.
That's
but
okay.
For example, if we organize ourselves and we go in this direction, and it's a beautiful direction for the majority of the population to regain our freedom and liberty. You know, there is this expression, for those who have the privileges, equality seems an oppression, you know. I think if we organize ourselves and we start to, and it has been experiences in the past, the people who organize it and they try to create this reality, the people who have privileges, or the groups of people of the privileges, they look at this as a like menace, something like a danger for themselves, okay, because they would lose the privileges and they would maybe create an oppression or try to not let us go in this direction. So what to do in this case?
So what I'd say is that this effort to become free is a very grassroots, individual man and woman decision. It's not going to be backed by any popular movement, by any government, by any corporation or any profit-making business. It's going to have to be a case of individuals make the decision to up and walk out of the system the way it is, and then support each other, those who also believe like-mindedly, to do so. That's the only way I can see it, because again, it's very financially profitable to keep slaves in the plantation, so no plantation owner will give you the support or the help in order to leave his plantation. You know, this is the oldest challenge of all of humanity. It's a challenge that we witnessed far back from Babylon, the first civilization, through Egypt, through the Roman Empire, and now through industrialization. How do a group of men, very small group of men and women, end up being in charge of ruling millions? You know, that again is a psychological a technique.
How do you came to this state of mind or this philosophy? There was a turning point, or it was because of the...
There were two turning points. So the first turning point was observation of how everything was working. So I used to travel to many countries. I traveled to Uganda, I traveled to Peru, I traveled to other parts which were considered third world, for example. However, I realized that these nations are not actually third world, they're the real first world. They have climate, and they have the ability to grow food all year round. They have a diversity of crops. So how is it that these countries that has an abundance ends up being in famine and hunger? And I started to realize, okay, it's not that these nations can't produce the food, but it's that economically, the wealthier countries which cannot produce the food all year round, example, the United States, North America, Northern Europe, you know, countries like this cannot produce food all year round. So they essentially have created a way by which they can take all the produce from one part of the world that produce it, Africa, Latin America, Asia, for example, and bring it so they can feed their population. And how do they do this? Well, economic slavery, usury. So basically, I recommend the viewers to study the International Monetary System, to study the IMF, the World Bank. So basically, they're economic hitmen, as has been described by some commentators. What they do is they go into a country, somewhere in Africa, somewhere in Latin America, somewhere that has an abundance of resource, be it food or be it natural materials. They basically convince the corrupt governments in those countries that they're to take out a loan from the IMF and the World Bank. So that's the International Monetary Fund. So what happens is they basically say, okay, Ecuador, for example, we're going to loan you $2 million or $5 million so you can improve your infrastructure, you can build bridges, build roads, and it'll be a benefit for your nation. But what the IMF and the World Bank don't tell you is that they're going to put an interest charge on that money, which means that the interest is going to keep compounding. It's going to keep exponentially growing every single year, quicker than you're ever be able to pay it. So you will not be able to pay off the principal that you borrowed until you pay off the interest. But the interest exponentially keeps doubling and doubling and doubling. You will never be able to pay it off. It's basically an economic trap. It's a fraud. It's a way by which wealthier nations that give these loans with the interest can permanently and perpetually have a hold over these countries. I mean, an example, if they took out a loan for, let's say, $5 million to build a bridge, after 20 years, they would have paid a total of maybe $30 million, and that's just the interest. You see, it's a trap. They'll never ever be able to stop paying it. So this is the way by which rich nations will permanently keep poorer nations in slavery. It's written about it in the Bible, in the Quran, and all, even Confucius in China, even the ancient books, the Vedas in India, they all forbade usury, because again, usury is the single most effective way by which you can destroy nations, you can cause huge populations generationally in slavery and servitude. This is why usury is the root cause of every suffering that you see, because these poor countries now, because they're in perpetual debt, a forever debt they can never finish paying, then they have to start chopping down their rainforests, poaching their elephants. They have to basically find buyers for all the last bit of resource left until there is nothing left. And this is not just a consequence for those nations, it will be the consequence also for the wealthier nations, because usury was the reason by which all Western civilizations also collapsed. It was usury, same as the Roman Empire. Basically, small groups of people creating a money system by which only they will benefit. You know, we see the superficial things of clothing, we see all the superficial things, we think that we're advanced and we think that we're secure. We're not, we're basically on a escalator going downwards. It's just a matter of time. Every generation is suffering more and more, to the point where the wealthier nations aren't even able to have any more children healthily to produce, to sustain their populations. So we are in a civilization collapse. It's just that you won't see it overnight. It will just take a few generations, but it's already heading that way. And unless a few brave people are willing to change their lifestyle and go back to a more simple, natural way of life, I don't really see much of a way out of this, really, because civilizations have collapsed before us. It's not a theory. It's an evident fact. It's history. It's already happened many times before. Why would it be any different now?